Pam Bondi had seen it all. Years in the legal trenches had hardened her against intimidation, theatrics, and the kind of egos that thrived on power. But as she stepped into Judge Howard Gates' courtroom, something felt off. Gates wasn't just a tough judge. He was the kind of man who liked to remind people who was in charge. His rulings were unpredictable, his tongue sharp, and his patience non-existent. She wasn't here for games. This case, an ethics violation involving a powerful real estate developer funneling public funds into his private projects, was the kind that didn't just make headlines, it made careers or ended them. The evidence was airtight, the financial records clear as day. But Bondi knew better than to assume justice was automatic, especially in a courtroom where the judge had already decided he didn't like her. She approached the plaintiff's table, setting her files down with the same steady calm she'd honed over years of high-stakes litigation. Across the room, the defense team sat relaxed, too comfortable for a case this damning. That was never a good sign. Gates, seated high on the bench, didn't even look up as she prepared to speak. Instead, he flipped lazily through a file, dragging out the silence just long enough to make a point. Then, without lifting his eyes, he finally spoke. "Miss Bondi, I assume you've prepared something of substance today, or should we just skip ahead to the part where you waste my time?" A couple of muffled chuckles rippled from the defense table. Bondi didn't flinch. She had been on the receiving end of worse. "Your Honor, I believe the evidence will speak for itself," she said evenly. "This case involves the misuse of taxpayer dollars, and my job is to ensure the facts are presented accurately." Gates leaned back in his chair, feigning boredom. "Taxpayer dollars, right? Because that's never been the foundation of a frivolous case before." Bondi held her ground. "Respectfully, Your Honor, I would hardly call felony corruption charges frivolous." Their eyes met, his cold and calculating, hers unwavering. She wasn't expecting a fair fight, but she also wasn't expecting what happened next. "Miss Bondi," Gates sighed, waving a hand dismissively, "spare me the lectures. Just get to the point. I don't have all day to entertain whatever grandstanding you have planned." There was a shift in the room. The tension thickened, murmurs spreading through the small crowd. Judges could be tough, but this was personal. Bondi took a measured breath, recalibrating. She knew exactly what he was doing, trying to put her on the defensive, trying to set the tempo so she was playing his game, not hers. Not happening. She flipped open a folder and held up the first document. "Your Honor, I'd like to direct the court's attention to Exhibit A. These financial records clearly demonstrate." "Do you always insist on drowning people in paperwork?" Gates interrupted. "Or is this just your way of compensating?" The defense attorney smirked. Bondi didn't react. She had learned long ago that men like Howard Gates thrived on intimidation. The only way to beat them was to never let them see you rattle. She paused just long enough to make a statement without saying a word. Then, setting the folder down, she clasped her hands together. "Your Honor, if you'd prefer to continue making this personal, I'm happy to request a recess while we address any professional concerns you may have." It was subtle, not aggressive, not disrespectful, but pointed, a warning. The corner of Gates' mouth curled slightly. Was that amusement? Annoyance? Hard to tell, but he wasn't done, not yet. "Oh, I don't have concerns, Miss Bondi," he said, voice dripping with condescension. "I just know a weak case when I see one." A ripple went through the room. Someone exhaled sharply. This wasn't how a judge was supposed to conduct a hearing. Bondi adjusted a stack of papers, keeping her expression neutral. "Then I suppose we should let the evidence do the talking." She didn't miss the flicker in his expression. It wasn't just arrogance. There was something deeper, a stake in the outcome, and that's when she knew. This wasn't just courtroom theatrics. Judge Gates wasn't just being combative for sport. He had something to hide. Pam Bondi had been in tough courtrooms before, but this wasn't tough. This was something else. Judge Howard Gates wasn't just ruling from the bench. He was playing a game, a calculated, deliberate attempt to undermine her in front of the entire courtroom. But why? She could feel the weight of his stare as she moved through her argument, the way he was waiting, almost eager to pounce on anything she said. He wasn't just testing her. He was waiting for her to misstep, to get rattled, to lose control of the room. She wasn't about to give him that. "Your Honor," she said evenly, These documents show a clear discrepancy in the funding allocations. The defendant's company received nearly triple the amount approved in the original budget, and none of it was accounted for in state records. She gestured toward the projection screen displaying the financial statements. Now, if you look here, I hate to interrupt your presentation, really. I do. Gates cut in, his voice dripping with false sincerity, but I think we've seen enough numbers for one day. Bondi glanced at him, then back at the screen. He wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. Your Honor, with all due respect, these numbers are the foundation of the case. Gates scoffed. And yet, I fail to see anything that justifies wasting the court's time like this. There it was again. Wasting time. He was trying to bury this case before it even got off the ground. Behind her, the prosecution team shifted, exchanging glances. They felt it too. Something wasn't right. Bondi tightened her grip on her pen, flipping to the next page in her file. Your Honor, I'd like to submit a motion to. Denied. She looked up. I haven't even stated the motion yet. And yet, I can already tell you it's going nowhere, Gates said, his voice smooth, almost bored. He leaned forward slightly. Let's be honest, Miss Bondi. This entire case is built on speculation, a little creative accounting, and suddenly, you're crying corruption? The defense attorney smirked. He hadn't said a word in nearly 20 minutes. He didn't have to. Gates was doing all the work for him. Bondi exhaled slowly. Your Honor, are you refusing to allow my motion before hearing its contents? A beat. A second too long. Then, I'm refusing to indulge this circus act any longer. The courtroom wasn't just tense now, it was shifting. Eyes darted, heads turned. Even the reporters in the back were scribbling faster. Bondi caught the glance of one of the jurors, a woman in her 50s, dressed in a dark blazer. Her brows furrowed, lips pressed together. She wasn't the only one noticing. The problem with arrogance? It makes people pay attention. Bondi squared her shoulders. Very well, Your Honor. Then let's proceed with the next piece of evidence. She clicked to the next slide. This document, obtained through a subpoena, shows that Miss Bondi. The tone was different this time. A shift. She stopped, looked at him. Judge Gates was no longer leaning back in his chair, no longer wearing that smug expression. His hands were clasped now, his mouth a thin, hard line. Approach the bench. It wasn't a request. She hesitated, then set her papers down and walked toward him. The courtroom hushed. When she reached the bench, his voice dropped, just enough so only she could hear. I'd strongly suggest you reconsider the direction you're taking here, Miss Bondi. She tilted her head slightly. Excuse me? I'm saying, he murmured, that some fights aren't worth having. She let that sit in the air between them. Then, slowly, deliberately, she leaned in just an inch closer. I don't scare easily, Judge Gates. A muscle in his jaw twitched. She turned and walked back to her table. That moment told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't just bias. Gates was protecting someone or something. The question was, what? Pam Bondi returned to her seat, mind racing. That wasn't just a power move. That was a warning. A quiet, deliberate way of telling her to back off, which meant she was getting close. She adjusted the stack of papers in front of her, keeping her expression neutral. The prosecution team beside her shifted, waiting for her to react. She didn't. Not yet. She lifted her chin and faced the judge. Your Honor, I'd like to continue presenting my evidence. Gates didn't respond right away. Instead, he let the silence stretch, as if deciding how far he wanted to push. Then, finally, proceed, but keep it brief. Bondi didn't acknowledge the jab. She simply reached for the next file. This document is a contract signed between the defendant and the city's planning board outlining the proposed project expenses. You'll notice that the listed costs total just over $2 million. She placed another sheet on the projector. However, this is an internal ledger from the defendant's company showing that the actual funds transferred were nearly double that amount. And then, deliberately, precisely, she placed a third document down. And here, she said, is the approval signature, signed off by. She let the moment land. Judge Howard Gates. The courtroom didn't just shift, it cracked. A ripple of movement. Pens scratching, eyes darting. At the defense table, the smirk vanished from the attorney's face. His client, the powerful developer whose empire had been built on backroom deals and political favors, had gone pale. But it was Gates who gave her exactly what she was looking for. For the first time since she'd stepped into this courtroom, he didn't speak. He didn't move. His face was unreadable. Bondi let the silence stretch a moment longer, then continued. Your Honor, she said, her voice steady, would you like to explain why your signature appears on an unauthorized financial transaction involving the defendant? A calculated risk. She didn't have the full story yet, but she had enough to shake the foundation beneath him. Gates finally moved, shifting slightly in his seat, his fingers pressed together, knuckles whitening. That document, he said slowly, is inadmissible. Bondi tilted her head. How so? It was obtained improperly. She let that sink in. Your Honor, this document was subpoenaed by my office. His nostrils flared. Then it was mishandled. I'm ruling it inadmissible. It will not be considered by this court. This time, the shift wasn't just in the gallery. It was everywhere. The jury, the stenographer, even the bailiff. Everyone was watching. Bondi folded her arms. You do realize this is a public hearing, correct? That the media is here? That every single person in this room just saw you declare critical financial evidence inadmissible without reason? A muscle jumped in his jaw. That's enough, Miss Bondi. She didn't move, didn't blink. Then slowly, she sat down. And that's when she did something that changed everything. She reached into her case, pulled out a small recorder, placed it on the table, and pressed play. A voice filled the courtroom, low, gruff, unmistakable. Take care of it. I don't care how. The recording crackled. Make sure she doesn't get her hands on those ledgers. Silence. Absolute. Suffocating. Judge Gates didn't move, didn't breathe. Bondi didn't look at him. She didn't need to, because now every single person in this room had heard him, and the real game was about to begin. The recording ended, but the silence didn't. It stretched, thick and suffocating, pressing down on every corner of the courtroom. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. For the first time, Judge Howard Gates had no words. Across the room, the defense attorney finally blinked. His composure slipped, just a fraction, but enough. He glanced at his client, the wealthy developer who had walked into this trial expecting nothing more than a formality. The man looked sick. Gates swallowed. Miss Bondi, I don't know where you obtained that recording, but that's not the question you should be asking, Your Honor, Bondi interrupted, her voice calm. The real question is, who were you talking to? His fingers curled into fists. This is outrageous, he snapped. This entire hearing is descending into chaos because of your grandstanding. Bondi leaned back slightly. Chaos? Her tone was almost amused. I'd say this is clarity. Finally, we have some transparency in this courtroom. The tension spiked again. She let the moment breathe, let him sweat. Then, with deliberate precision, she reached for another document and slid it across the table. Your Honor, she said smoothly, this is a transcript of a wiretap, legally obtained during our investigation. She tapped the top of the page. It corroborates everything you just heard. Gates stared at the document, but didn't touch it. His chest rose and fell, his breathing suddenly louder in the quiet room. Bondi turned slightly. Officer Reynolds, she said, addressing the bailiff. Would you kindly read the highlighted section aloud? A pause, a flicker of hesitation. Then the bailiff picked up the transcript. His voice was steady, but the weight of the words made the room feel smaller. We'll take care of her. Bondi doesn't have anything solid yet, but if she does, I'll make sure it never sees the inside of a courtroom. A sharp inhale came from somewhere in the gallery. Bondi folded her hands together. I'd like to submit this as evidence, Your Honor. For a long moment, Gates said nothing. His eyes flicked, just briefly, toward the exit. A small movement, almost imperceptible, but it told the whole story. For the first time, he was thinking about something other than his own arrogance. He was thinking about escape. Bondi caught it, so did the bailiff, so did the jury, but it was far too late for that. Motion denied, Gates barked. His voice was a fraction too loud, his tone unsteady. This hearing is over. I will not allow. Judge Gates, Bondi said smoothly, I wasn't asking for your permission. And then she did it. The move she had been waiting for. She turned toward the back of the courtroom and gave the smallest, subtlest nod. A door opened. Footsteps echoed against the polished floor. And then, Judge Howard Gates, a firm, authoritative voice announced, You are under arrest. Gasps erupted from every corner of the room. Reporters fumbled for their phones. Cameras clicked. The jury gaped. Even the defendant, The powerful man who had expected this trial to be nothing more than a technicality looked genuinely stunned. Gates didn't turn. He didn't even speak. He just sat there, eyes fixed on a single point on his bench, as if he could make everything disappear if he just didn't move. But reality had already caught up with him. Two uniformed officers flanked him. One reached into his pocket. The other pulled out a set of cuffs. "This is absurd," Gates muttered, though the fight had already drained from his voice. The officer didn't blink. "You have the right to remain silent." For the first time in his career, Judge Howard Gates actually was. The sound of metal clicking shut was deafening. The cuffs locked around his wrists, sealing his fate in front of the very people he had spent years ruling over. The courtroom erupted, not in chaos, not in shouting, just a stunned, disbelieving hum of whispers, hurried notes scribbled by reporters, a jury struggling to process what they had just witnessed. A judge, their judge, hauled out in cuffs, a man who had ruled over cases, shaped verdicts, controlled the very system that had just turned on him. Pam Bondi stayed seated, her face unreadable. This wasn't about gloating. It wasn't about revenge. This was about justice. Gates finally found his voice. "You can't do this." The words came out low, almost a whisper, as if he himself didn't believe them. The officer holding his arm didn't flinch. "Sir, you are being taken into custody for obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit fraud, and abuse of judicial power. You'll have your chance to speak with an attorney." Gates yanked against the cuffs, his face flushing. "This is a disgrace. I am the law in this courtroom." Bondi finally stood, adjusting the papers in front of her. Not anymore. His head snapped toward her. For the first time, the arrogance was gone. In its place, something else, something closer to fear. The officers pulled him to his feet. He resisted. "This is political. Bondi shook her head. "This is accountability." The room went silent again. A lifetime of unchecked power, gone in an instant. Gates's face twisted as he turned to the gallery, scanning the crowd. His eyes darted from face to face, searching for someone, anyone, to step in, to call this a mistake, to stop what was happening. But no one moved, because it wasn't a mistake. At the defense table, the attorney had gone ghost white, and the developer, the man who had been untouchable for years, looked like he had just seen his entire empire crumble. His fingers gripped the edge of the table, his breathing shallow. Bondi let her eyes linger on him for just a second before turning back to the judge. "Your Honor," she said, her voice calm, measured, "if you have anything to say, I'd suggest you save it for your arraignment." Gates's mouth opened, then shut, because there was nothing left to say. The officers began escorting him toward the side exit. And then, "Wait." The voice came from the defense table, the developer. His chair scraped loudly against the floor as he stood, eyes darting between Gates and Bondi. His suit, once pristine, once the uniform of a man who knew he was protected, suddenly looked suffocating. "This is getting out of hand," he said quickly. "We can work something out." Bondi turned to him, one eyebrow raised. "Work something out?" He swallowed. "I mean, there's no need for this kind of public spectacle. Let's be reasonable." Bondi studied him. "You seem nervous, Mr. Lawson." His mouth opened, but no words came. She tilted her head. "Why would that be?" He forced a laugh. "Nervous? No. This is insane. You don't seriously believe Gates is guilty, do you?" She let the question hang in the air. Then quietly she asked, "Do you?" Silence. The officers moved again, leading Gates through the door. The moment it shut behind him, the weight of it settled over the room. This wasn't just a case anymore. This was the unraveling of a system that had been protected for far too long. And Bondi wasn't done yet. The courtroom wasn't the same place it had been an hour ago. The balance of power had shifted. The walls that had protected the powerful had started to crack, and everyone in that room knew it. Pam Bondi took her seat again, adjusting the papers in front of her, but she wasn't looking at them. Her focus was on Charles Lawson. The developer had gone eerily quiet. The usual smugness, the casual confidence, gone. He was still trying to assess the damage. How much of his safety net had just been ripped away? How far this would go? Without Gates on the bench, his legal team would have to argue the case on its own merits, and they had none. Bondi leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Lawson, would you like to continue with today's proceedings, or would you prefer to discuss a plea?" His jaw clenched. "This is a witch hunt." Bondi gave a small smile. No, Mr. Lawson, this is justice, he scoffed, shaking his head. You think one corrupt judge changes anything? You think this means you win? She didn't respond right away. Instead, she let the silence stretch, let the weight of the moment sink in. I think it means the system still works, she said finally. That no matter how powerful someone thinks they are, the truth will always catch up to them. Lawson exhaled sharply, but he had nothing left to say. The judge's seat remained empty, but it didn't matter. This case was no longer in his hands. The prosecution team exchanged glances. One of Bondi's colleagues leaned in. This might be a good time to push for a deal. She considered it. She could feel the shift in the room, the way the jury was watching, waiting. They had just witnessed something they'd never forget. But she wasn't about to let this end with a whisper. She stood. Your Honor, she started, then paused, correcting herself. To the presiding judge who will take over this case, I'd like to submit a formal request to proceed with additional evidence. Given today's events, it's clear we need a full investigation into how far this corruption reaches. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Bondi continued. Judge Gates was only part of the problem. If my team could uncover this, it means there's more. More names. More people who thought they were untouchable. She turned to Lawson. So, I'll ask you again. Do you want to talk? He sat rigid, fingers tapping against the table, weighing his options. Then finally, he exhaled. If I do, I want protection. Bondi nodded slowly. Then you'd better start talking. The courtroom wasn't the same place it had been an hour ago. The balance of power had shifted, and Pam Bondi had just sent a message to everyone watching. No one is above the law. As the bailiff called for order and the trial prepared to move forward, the reporters in the back of the room rushed to get their stories out. This wasn't just another case. This was history, and it was only the beginning. Justice isn't just about laws. It's about the people who stand up for what's right, even when the odds are stacked against them. This story is a reminder that power unchecked is power abused, but the truth has a way of finding the light. No matter how high the walls are built, accountability will always come knocking. If you enjoyed this story and believe in the power of truth, support our channel by simply hitting the like button. Leave a comment below to let us know where you're watching from and what you think about the story. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And most importantly, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another story. Thank you for being part of this journey with us.